The morning sun was just starting to peek through the clouds as David walked into London Heathrow Airport. He looked like any other young man heading out on a trip, wearing his favorite blue jeans, a comfortable gray sweater, and carrying a simple black backpack. Nothing about him screamed wealth or importance. He could have been a college student, a construction worker, or just someone visiting family. But looks can be deceiving. David had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because his flight was early, but because he couldn't sleep. Today wasn't just any travel day. After 18 months of non-stop duty, he was finally getting time off to visit his sister Claire, who was fighting the hardest battle of her life in a New York hospital. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about her recovery, but David knew she needed all the support she could get. He had saved up every penny for months to buy that first-class ticket. It wasn't about luxury or showing off. It was about arriving fresh and ready to be there for Claire. The economy seats on the 8-hour flight to New York would have left him cramped and tired, and his sister deserved better than a worn-out visitor. As David approached the check-in counter, he pulled out his boarding pass from his phone. The airline employee glanced at it, then looked at him with raised eyebrows. "First class?" she asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Yes, ma'am," David replied politely, the way he'd been trained to speak to everyone with respect. She processed his ticket, but he could feel her eyes studying him. When she handed back his passport, she held onto it just a moment longer than necessary, as if she was trying to figure out how this ordinary-looking guy could afford a seat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. David didn't mind. He was used to people making assumptions about him. In his line of work, blending in was actually an advantage. The less attention he drew to himself, the better he could do his job. He made his way through security without any issues and found a quiet corner near his gate to wait. He pulled out a worn paperback book, a thriller novel he'd been trying to finish for weeks. Between his duties and training, finding time to read was a luxury he rarely enjoyed. As he read, David's mind kept drifting to Claire. They had always been close, even though their careers had taken them in completely different directions. She was a teacher in Brooklyn, spending her days with kids who needed someone to believe in them. When she'd first been diagnosed, she'd joked that fighting cancer couldn't be harder than managing a classroom full of 8-year-olds. But David knew better. He'd seen real battles, real fights where people's lives hung in the balance. This was different, though. This was his little sister, and there wasn't anything he could do except be there for her. When boarding began, David waited until his group was called. He wasn't the type to rush or push ahead. Patience had been drilled into him through years of training and service. He'd learned that sometimes the most important skill was simply knowing when to wait. He approached the gate agent, with his boarding pass ready on his phone. She scanned it, and he heard the familiar beep that meant everything was in order. But as he walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, David had no idea that his quiet, peaceful journey was about to become anything but ordinary. The flight attendant at the entrance of the plane barely looked up as passengers filed past her. She was busy checking her tablet and making notes. When David reached her, he paused politely and smiled. "Good morning," he said, showing her his boarding pass on his phone screen. The flight attendant looked at the screen, then up at David, then back at the screen. Her expression changed from professional politeness to confusion, and then to something that looked almost like suspicion. "This shows first class," she said slowly. "Yes, that's right," David replied, still maintaining his friendly tone. She looked him up and down, taking in his casual clothes, his simple backpack, and his young face. Her eyes lingered on his hands, which showed the calluses of someone who worked hard for a living, though she had no way of knowing what kind of work that might be. "Are you sure this is your boarding pass?" she asked in a tone that suggested she thought he might have made some kind of mistake. David felt a small knot form in his stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I purchased the ticket myself about 3 months ago." The flight attendant called over her colleague, a tall man with silver hair, who seemed to be the head of the cabin crew. They spoke in hushed tones for a moment, both glancing at David as they talked. "Sir," the silver-haired man said, approaching David with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We're having a small issue with our seating chart today. Would you mind if we double-checked your ticket? David showed him the boarding pass again, and the man studied it carefully. Meanwhile, other passengers were backing up behind David, some beginning to look impatient. The thing is, the head attendant continued, we've had some problems lately with people accidentally booking the wrong class of service. Or sometimes there are technical glitches with our system. I'm quite sure about my ticket, David said, calmly. I specifically chose first class because I have a family emergency to attend to, and I wanted to arrive rested. The first attendant whispered something to her supervisor, and David caught the words, doesn't look right, and probably, can't afford it. The knot in his stomach grew tighter. He'd faced down much more dangerous situations than this, but something about being judged purely on his appearance in such a public way made him feel uncomfortable in a way that physical threats never had. Sir, I'm going to need to see a photo ID along with your boarding pass, the supervisor said, though David noticed that he hadn't asked any of the other first-class passengers for additional identification. David pulled out his passport without argument. The supervisor examined it thoroughly, comparing the photo to David's face multiple times. And this ticket was purchased on your credit card? The supervisor asked. Yes, David replied, beginning to feel frustrated but working hard to keep it out of his voice. It's just that we've had issues with stolen credit cards being used to purchase expensive tickets, the first attendant chimed in, loud enough that several passengers nearby could hear. David felt his face flush, not from anger, but from embarrassment. People were staring now, and he could hear murmurs from the passengers waiting behind him. Some seemed sympathetic, but others appeared to be agreeing with the crew's suspicions. A woman in expensive jewelry and designer clothes, who was clearly also heading to first class, stepped forward. Is there a problem? She asked in a tone that suggested she was used to having her concerns addressed immediately. Just a small delay, ma'am, the supervisor assured her. We're sorting out a ticketing issue. The woman looked at David and shook, her head slightly, as if she'd seen this kind of thing before and disapproved of people trying to sneak into first class. Look, David said quietly, trying to keep his voice low so as not to disturb the other passengers more than necessary. I understand you're just doing your job, but I've shown you my valid boarding pass and passport. I purchased this ticket legally with my own money, and I'd like to get to my seat so we can get this flight moving. The supervisor exchanged another look with the first attendant. David could see them weighing their options. They clearly weren't convinced he belonged in first class, but they also couldn't find anything technically wrong with his documentation. Tell you what, the supervisor finally said in a tone that suggested he thought he was being very reasonable. Why don't we get you settled in a nice economy seat for now, and once we're in the air, we can sort this whole thing out properly. Bye. Blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing. You want me to give up my paid seat because you don't think I look like I can afford it? That's not what I said, the supervisor replied quickly, though his tone suggested that was exactly what he meant. I'm just trying to avoid any further delays for our other passengers. The wealthy woman nodded approvingly. That seems fair, she said. I'm sure the young man will be more comfortable with people more like himself. David felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd been prepared for a lot of things on this trip, but he hadn't been prepared for this kind of treatment. He looked around at the faces staring at him, some curious, some judgmental, some uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. He thought about Claire, waiting for him in that hospital room 3,000 miles away. He thought about how much this ticket had cost him, and how he'd specifically chosen first class so he'd arrive ready to support his sister through whatever came next. But he also thought about all the training he'd received about when to fight and when to retreat. Sometimes he'd learned the most strategic thing to do was to avoid a battle that would cost more than it was worth. Fine, David said quietly, shouldering his backpack. Where would you like me to sit? The relief on the crew's faces was obvious. They quickly found him a middle seat in economy, sandwiched between a businessman typing furiously on his laptop and a teenager with headphones who barely looked up when David squeezed past. As David settled into his cramped seat, he could hear the smooth efficiency with which the first-class passengers were now being welcomed aboard. No additional questions, no requests for extra identification, just warm smiles and offers of champagne. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes when things started to get worse for David. He was trying his best to make the most of his cramped middle seat, but the businessman next to him kept expanding into David's space with his laptop, papers, and briefcase. Every few minutes, the man would glance at David with obvious irritation, as if David was somehow responsible for the tight seating arrangement. On his other side, the teenager had fallen asleep and was now leaning heavily against David's shoulder. David didn't mind. The kid looked exhausted, and David had certainly slept in worse conditions, but it made his already small space even smaller. David tried to focus on his book, but he kept thinking about what had happened at the boarding gate. The more he replayed it in his mind, the angrier he became. Not just angry about losing his seat, but angry about the assumptions people had made about him. Angry about the way the crew had treated him like he was trying to pull some kind of scam. He'd worked incredibly hard for everything he had. The money for that first-class ticket had come from months of careful saving, skipping meals out, avoiding unnecessary purchases, and setting aside every spare dollar. And he hadn't done it for luxury. He'd done it because he wanted to be at his best for his sister when he arrived. But apparently none of that mattered if you didn't look the part. David was pulled from his thoughts by a commotion a few rows ahead. A passenger was trying to get the attention of a flight attendant, waving his hand in the air. "Excuse me, miss," the passenger called out. "I think there's been some kind of mistake with the seating." David looked up to see what was happening. The passenger was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, and he was pointing directly at David. "That young man there," the suited passenger continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I saw him trying to get into first class earlier, and the crew had to move him back here. I just wanted to make sure you're aware that he might try again." David felt his face burn with embarrassment. Other passengers were turning to look at him now, and he could see the mixture of curiosity and judgment in their eyes. The flight attendant, the same one who had questioned David's ticket at boarding, walked over with a concerned expression. "Is there a problem, Mr. Richardson?" she asked the suited passenger, using a tone of respect that she definitely hadn't used with David. "Well, I don't want to cause trouble," Mr. Richardson said, though his voice suggested he was perfectly happy to cause exactly that. "But I paid good money for my first-class seat, and I don't appreciate having to worry about people trying to sneak up there who don't belong." "Of course, sir," the flight attendant replied. "I completely understand your concern." She turned to look at David, and her expression hardened. "Sir, I hope we won't have any more issues with you trying to access areas of the plane where you don't have authorization." David looked up from his book, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," she said, her voice loud enough that half the economy section could hear. "I'm just making it clear that you need to stay in your assigned seat." "I haven't left my assigned seat," David replied, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "I've been sitting right here since takeoff." Mr. Richardson snorted. "That's not what I'm talking about, son. I'm talking about your little stunt at the gate, trying to use a ticket that obviously wasn't yours." David felt something snap inside him. He closed his book carefully and looked directly at Mr. Richardson. "That ticket was mine," David said quietly. "I paid for it with my own money, with my own credit card. I was moved back here because the crew decided I didn't look like I belonged in first class." "Oh, please." Mr. Richardson laughed, and several other passengers joined in. "A kid your age wearing clothes from a discount store? You expect us to believe you can afford a first-class ticket that costs more than most people make in a month?" David felt the eyes of everyone around him. Some passengers looked uncomfortable with the confrontation, but others were nodding along with Mr. Richardson's words. "My clothes don't determine what I can afford," David said, his voice still controlled but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Listen, kid," Mr. Richardson said, leaning forward in his seat. "I've been flying first class for 20 years. I know the kind of people who belong up there, and I know the kind who don't. You don't." The flight attendant was watching this exchange with obvious approval. Instead of trying to diffuse the situation, she seemed to be enjoying watching David get put in what she clearly thought was his place. "Maybe we should all just calm down," said an older woman sitting across the aisle from David. She had kind eyes, and a gentle voice. "There's no need for all this drama." "Ma'am, with respect," Mr. Richardson replied. "People like you are part of the problem. You're too polite to call out obvious fraud when you see it. This young man clearly used someone else's credit card, or found some other way to illegally purchase that ticket." David's hands clenched into fists. In his line of work, he'd been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly when others were losing their heads. But right now, with dozens of strangers making assumptions about his character and his integrity, that training was being pushed to its limits. "Sir," David said, his voice very quiet now, "I'm going to ask you politely to stop making accusations about me that you can't prove." "Or what?" Mr. Richardson laughed. "What are you going to do about it, kid?" The flight attendant stepped in before David could respond. "Okay, I think that's enough," she said, but she was looking at David when she said it, not at Mr. Richardson. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your voice down and avoid causing any more disturbances." "Me?" David asked, genuinely shocked. "I'm not the one causing a disturbance. You're the one who tried to use a ticket that didn't belong to you," the flight attendant replied. "And now you're arguing with other passengers. If this continues, we're going to have to consider other options." David stared at her. "Other options?" "The captain has the authority to have disruptive passengers removed from the aircraft at the next airport," she said, and David could hear the threat in her voice clearly. He looked around at the faces staring at him. Mr. Richardson was smiling smugly. The flight attendant looked like she was hoping David would give her a reason to follow through on her threat. A few passengers looked uncomfortable, but no one was speaking up for him. David thought about his sister, alone in that hospital bed in New York. He thought about how much it would cost to rebook another flight, money he didn't have. He thought about how Claire was counting on him to be there, and how she'd worry if he didn't show up when he was supposed to. "Fine," David said, his voice barely audible. "I'll keep quiet." "Good," the flight attendant said with satisfaction. "I'm glad we understand each other." As she walked away, Mr. Richardson leaned back in his seat with a pleased expression. "Nothing personal, kid," he said in a voice that suggested it was very personal indeed. "But people need to know their place." David didn't respond. He opened his book again and stared at the pages, but he wasn't reading. He was thinking about dignity, about respect, about what it meant to be judged not by your actions or your character, but by your age and your clothes and the assumptions people made when they looked at you. He was also thinking about something else, something that Mr. Richardson and the flight attendant and all the other passengers who had watched this scene unfold had no way of knowing. Something that was hidden beneath his simple gray sweater, something that would change everything if they knew about it. But David wasn't the type to flash credentials or demand special treatment. He'd been raised to let his actions speak louder than his titles or his achievements. Even now, humiliated and angry as he was, his first instinct was to stay quiet and avoid making the situation worse. The businessman next to him was typing again, his elbow digging into David's ribs with each keystroke. The teenager was still asleep against his shoulder. The plane droned on through the sky, carrying him toward his sister and away from everything familiar. David closed his eyes and tried to center himself the way he'd been trained to do in difficult situations. He breathed slowly and steadily, letting his heart rate return to normal. He reminded himself that these people didn't know him, that their opinions didn't define him, that getting angry wouldn't help anyone. But underneath his calm exterior, something was building. Not anger exactly, but a quiet determination. These people had made assumptions about him based on nothing but his appearance. They'd treated him with disrespect and suspicion. They'd tried to make him feel small and unwelcome. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and in a few hours, David thought, as he finally managed to focus on his book, they were going to find out. The plane continued its journey across the Atlantic, carrying passengers who thought they knew everything about each other based on first impressions. But sometimes, David reflected, the most important truths are the ones that can't be seen on the surface. Soon enough, everyone on this flight was going to learn that lesson in a way they'd never forget. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into the usual rhythm of long-distance travel. Most passengers were either sleeping, reading, or staring at their personal entertainment screens. David had managed to find some peace in his cramped middle seat, though his long legs were starting to cramp from being folded into such a small space. The businessman next to him had finally put away his laptop and was dozing fitfully. The teenager on his other side was still sound asleep, her head now resting against the window instead of David's shoulder, which gave him a bit more room to breathe. David had been reading the same page of his book for the past 20 minutes. His mind kept wandering to Claire, to what the doctors had told him about her treatment, to how scared she'd sounded during their last phone call. He'd promised her he'd be there for her next round of chemotherapy, and he meant to keep that promise, no matter what it took. The cabin was warm, warmer than David was comfortable with. He'd always run hot, something that had served him well during long winter duties but made airplane travel uncomfortable. He glanced around to make sure he wouldn't disturb anyone, then carefully peeled off his gray sweater. As he pulled the sweater over his head, something caught the light. Several passengers nearby noticed the glint of metal beneath his simple white t-shirt. At first it looked like he might be wearing some kind of chain or pendant, but as David folded his sweater and placed it in the overhead compartment, the true nature of what he was wearing became clear. The elderly woman across the aisle was the first to really see it. Her eyes widened as she took in the ribbon and metal hanging from David's neck. She leaned forward slightly, squinting to get a better look, and then her expression changed completely. She wasn't just looking at any metal. She was looking at something she recognized, something she'd seen before in photographs and ceremonies, but never in person. The deep crimson ribbon, the bronze cross, the simple inscription that represented the highest honor her country could bestow. The Victoria Cross. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, so quietly that only David could hear her. David looked up from his book, following her gaze down to his chest. He'd forgotten that removing his sweater would reveal the medal. In his regular life, when he was on duty, it was always properly displayed as part of his uniform. In civilian clothes, he often forgot it was there. It had become such a natural part of him. "Ma'am?" David asked politely, noticing her stare. The elderly woman looked from the medal to his face and back again. "Young man," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you know what you're wearing?" David glanced down at the medal, then back at her. "Yes, ma'am, I do." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with new eyes. This wasn't just any young man who'd been treated poorly at the boarding gate. This wasn't just someone who didn't look like he belonged in first class. "My husband was in the military," she said softly. "Royal Navy. He always said that medal was the highest honor any of us could ever receive. He said the people who wear it are heroes." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm just someone who did his job, ma'am." But word was already beginning to spread. The passenger in the seat behind the elderly woman had overheard their conversation and was craning his neck to see what they were talking about. When he caught sight of the medal, his reaction was immediate and unmistakable. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked, his voice carrying further than he probably intended. The man was clearly former military himself. David could tell from his posture, his haircut, and the way he immediately recognized what he was seeing. When David nodded slightly, the man's entire demeanor changed. "Sir," he said, and the word carried weight and respect that hadn't been in anyone's voice when they'd spoken to David all day. "If I may ask, what branch?" "Army," David replied simply. "Queen's Guard." The former military man's eyes went wide. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial soldiers in fancy uniforms. They were elite fighters, rigorously selected and trained, responsible for protecting the most important people in the country. And someone wearing the Victoria Cross wasn't just any Queen's Guard. They were someone who had gone above and beyond, the call of duty in the most extreme circumstances possible. "What's going on?" asked another passenger, a middle-aged woman who had noticed the sudden change in atmosphere around David's seat. The elderly woman, who had first spotted the medal, looked at her with an expression of amazement. "This young man is a war hero," she said, loud enough for several rows to hear. "He's wearing the Victoria Cross." A ripple of awareness began to spread through the economy cabin. Passengers who had been ignoring their surroundings suddenly became alert. Those who knew what the Victoria Cross represented looked at David with newfound respect. Those who didn't know asked their neighbors, and word spread quickly about what that simple bronze medal meant. The Victoria Cross was only awarded for acts of extreme bravery in the face of enemy fire. It had been given to fewer than 1,400 people since it was created in 1856. Many of the recipients had died earning it. Those who survived to wear it were considered living legends. "Wait a minute," said a voice from several rows up. David looked up to see a man in his 50s standing up and turning to face him. "Are you telling me that's the same young man who was kicked out of first class at boarding?" The elderly woman nodded grimly. "The very same one. They treated him like he was trying to steal a seat." A murmur went through the cabin as passengers processed this information. The young man they'd watched get humiliated. The one Mr. Richardson had publicly accused of fraud. The one the flight attendant had threatened with removal from the plane. He wasn't just any ordinary passenger. David wished he could disappear into his seat. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd spent his career trying to avoid. In his line of work, being noticed was usually a bad thing. He preferred to blend into the background, to be just another face in the crowd. "What did you do to earn it?" asked the former military man, his voice full of respectful curiosity. David was quiet for a long moment. He'd never been comfortable talking about what had happened that day in Afghanistan. The memories were still too fresh, too painful. Good. People had died, and he'd survived. The medal felt more like a weight than an honor most days. "There was a situation," David said finally, his voice so quiet that people had to lean in to hear him. "Some of my mates were in trouble. I helped get them out." The former military man nodded knowingly. He understood that David's modest description probably covered something far more dramatic and dangerous than he was letting on. That was typical for people who wore that medal. They never talked about themselves as heroes, even when everyone else could see that's exactly what they were. "How old are you, son?" asked another passenger. 24, David replied. The number sent another wave of amazement through the cabin. The Victoria Cross was rarely awarded to anyone so young. Whatever David had done to earn it must have been extraordinary, even by the standards of extreme bravery that the medal represented. A woman a few rows ahead turned around in her seat to get a better look at David. "You're just a baby," she said, but her voice was full of motherly pride rather than condescension. "And you've already done more for your country than most people do in a lifetime." David felt his face flushing with embarrassment. "I really just did what anyone would have done in the same situation." "No," said the elderly woman firmly. "Anyone would not have done what you did. That's why you have that medal and the rest of us don't." The conversation was attracting more and more attention. Passengers were getting out of their seats to see what was happening, and those who couldn't see were asking their neighbors to explain. The story was spreading through the economy cabin like wildfire. The young man who'd been treated so poorly was actually one of the most decorated soldiers in the country. "This is incredible," said a young woman who had walked back from a seat near the front of economy. "Do you know what this means? They kicked a Victoria Cross recipient out of first class because they didn't think he looked like he could afford it." The implications of what had happened were starting to sink in for everyone. This wasn't just about poor customer service or unfortunate assumptions. This was about a genuine hero being treated with disrespect and suspicion by people who had no idea who they were dealing with. "Where's that flight attendant now?" asked someone angrily. "The one who threatened to have him removed from the plane?" "And what about that businessman who accused him of fraud?" added another voice. David could feel the mood in the cabin shifting. What had started as curiosity about his medal was turning into indignation about how he'd been treated. He appreciated the support, but he was also getting uncomfortable with being the center of so much attention. "Please," David said, raising his voice slightly so more people could hear him. "I don't want to cause any trouble. I just want to get to New York to see my sister." "You're not causing trouble," the elderly woman assured him. The trouble was caused by people who should have known better. A man in his 30s, wearing a business suit but clearly not the same businessman who had caused problems earlier, stood up and looked around the cabin. "I think we all owe this young man an apology," he said loudly. "All of us who sat here and watched him get treated poorly without a suck." The transformation in the cabin was remarkable to witness. What had started as a few whispered conversations about David's medal had grown into something much larger. Passengers who had been strangers to each other minutes before were now united in their outrage over how he'd been treated. "This is absolutely unacceptable," declared a woman in her 40s, who had been sitting quietly near the front of economy until now. "I watched that whole scene at boarding and it made me sick to my stomach. But I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get involved." She looked directly at David with tears in her eyes. "I'm ashamed of myself for not speaking up. You deserved better from all of us." Similar sentiments were echoing throughout the cabin. Passengers were sharing their own feelings of guilt about witnessing David's humiliation without intervening. The mood was shifting from curiosity to anger to determination. People wanted to do something to make this right. "Has anyone seen that businessman who started all this trouble?" asked the former military man, looking around the cabin with obvious irritation. "Richardson, I think his name was. He's up in first class," said someone who had watched the earlier confrontation. "Where he thinks he belongs and where he thinks our friend here doesn't." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Really, everyone, I appreciate the support, but I don't want to cause a big scene. I just want to get through this flight and get to my sister." "Your sister?" asked the elderly woman who had first spotted his medal. "Is she all right, dear?" David hesitated for a moment, then decided these people had already shown him more kindness than the crew had. "She's fighting cancer in New York. This is my first leave in 18 months, and I wanted to be there for her next treatment." A hush fell over the nearby passengers as they absorbed this information. Not only had they watched a war hero get humiliated based on his appearance, but he was traveling to support a family member going through one of the hardest battles anyone could face. "Oh, sweetheart," said the motherly woman from a few rows up, her voice breaking slightly. "You saved up for that first-class ticket so you'd arrive rested and ready to help your sister, didn't you?" David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Without his voice cracking, the woman turned to the passengers around her, her expression fierce. "That's it. I've heard enough. Someone needs to get the captain involved in this situation right now." "Agreed," said a man who had been listening to the conversation from across the aisle. "This isn't just about customer service anymore. This is about basic human decency and respect for someone who has served our country with distinction." A passenger near the front of economy stood up and started walking toward the galley where the flight attendants were stationed. But before he could get there, the same flight attendant who had confronted David earlier appeared, looking annoyed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to need everyone to return to your seats," she announced in a tone that suggested she was already frustrated. "The seatbelt sign isn't on, but we're experiencing some minor turbulence, and for safety reasons, we need everyone seated." There was no turbulence. The flight had been smooth as glass for the past hour. It was clear she had noticed the commotion, building around David's seat, and was trying to shut it down. "Actually, we need to speak with you," said the elderly woman, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with difficult people before. "About how you treated this young man at boarding." The flight attendant's expression tightened. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you heard, but I handled that situation exactly according to our protocols. If someone has a problem with how I do my job, they can file a complaint after the flight." "Protocols?" repeated the former military man, standing up to his full height, which was considerable. "Your protocols include accusing paying customers of fraud based on how they're dressed?" "Sir, please return to your seat," the flight attendant replied, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. She was clearly not used to being challenged by so many passengers at once. "Do you know who this young man is?" asked the businesswoman, who had apologized to David earlier. "Do you have any idea what that medal around his neck represents?" The flight attendant glanced at David, noticing the medal for the first time. Her expression flickered with something that might have been recognition, but she recovered quickly. "I don't care if he's wearing the crown jewels," she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "A ticket is a ticket, and if someone can't provide proper verification of their right to use it, then we have every right to question them. He provided proper verification, said another passenger angrily. He showed you his boarding pass and his passport. You moved him because you decided he didn't look like he belonged in first class. The flight attendant's face was beginning to flush. That's not... We had legitimate concerns about... About what? Interrupted the elderly woman. About a decorated war hero not looking wealthy enough for your tastes? War hero? The flight attendant's voice was smaller now. The former military man stepped closer, his expression serious. That medal he's wearing is the Victoria Cross. It's awarded for extreme bravery in combat. There are probably fewer than 100 people alive today who have the right to wear it. The flight attendant looked at David again, this time really seeing the medal. Her face went pale as the full implications of what she'd done began to sink in. And you want to know the best part? Continued the businesswoman. He was traveling to New York to be with his sister who's battling cancer. He spent months saving up for that first-class ticket so he could arrive rested and ready to support her. The flight attendant opened her mouth, then closed it again without saying anything. Around the cabin, more passengers were becoming aware of the confrontation, and David could feel dozens of pairs of eyes focused on their group. I think, said a new voice from behind them, that we need to get the captain involved in this situation. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was a woman in her 50s, wearing a business suit and carrying herself with obvious authority. She had been sitting in the premium economy section and had apparently come back to see what all the commotion was about. Ma'am, I'm sure that won't be necessary, the flight attendant said quickly. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? The businesswoman repeated. You accused a paying customer of fraud, moved him from his paid seat based purely on his appearance, and then threatened to have him removed from the aircraft when other passengers questioned your decision. That's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination. The woman in the business suit nodded. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights cases, and what I witnessed at boarding would make for a very interesting lawsuit. But more importantly, as a human being, I'm disgusted by what I saw. She looked at David with genuine respect. Sir, I want you to know that not everyone on this plane agreed with how you were treated. Some of us were just too shocked to react in the moment. David appreciated her words, but he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with being the center of so much attention. In his training, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to handle a situation was to de-escalate it rather than let it spiral out of control. Look, everyone, David said, standing up carefully in the cramped aisle. I really appreciate all of you standing up for me. It means more than you know. But I don't want this to become a bigger problem than it needs to be. Son, said the former military man gently, sometimes problems need to get bigger before they get better. What happened to you was wrong, and pretending it didn't happen won't prevent it from happening to the next person. The attorney nodded in agreement. He's right. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about making sure the airline understands that this kind of behavior is unacceptable and has consequences. The flight attendant was looking increasingly panicked as she realized how many passengers were involved in this confrontation and how serious the situation had become. Please, everyone, let's just calm down, she said, but her voice was shaking now. I'm sure we can work something out. Oh, we're definitely going to work something out, said the elderly woman with steel in her voice, starting with getting the captain down here to hear exactly what happened. Before the flight attendant could respond, another voice joined the conversation from the front of the economy section. What's all this noise back here? Everyone turned to see Mr. Richardson making his way down the aisle from first class. He looked irritated and superior, clearly expecting to put an end to whatever disturbance was happening in the cheap seats. But as he got closer and saw David standing in the aisle wearing the Victoria Cross, his expression began to change. He slowed his approach, his eyes fixed on the medal, his confident demeanor starting to crack. Oh, he said quietly, and for the first time since boarding, his voice carried no arrogance at all. The cabin fell silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Mr. Richardson, who had so loudly accused David of fraud and declared that he knew who belonged in first class and who didn't, was face to face with the truth about exactly who he'd been talking to. And that truth was about to change everything. The silence in the cabin was so complete that David could hear the hum of the airplane's engines more clearly than he had all flight. Mr. Richardson stood frozen in the aisle, staring at the Victoria Cross hanging around David's neck, his face cycling through emotions like shame, embarrassment, and something that looked like fear. "Is that—" Mr. Richardson started to say, then stopped, swallowing hard. "The Victoria Cross," finished the elderly woman, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "The highest military honor our country can award, worn by the young man you so publicly accused of fraud." The color drained completely from Mr. Richardson's face. He looked from the medal to David's calm, steady gaze, and then to the dozens of passengers who were watching this moment unfold. I didn't know," he stammered. "Of course you didn't know," said the attorney, stepping closer, "because you didn't bother to find out. You saw a young man in casual clothes and decided you knew everything about him. You made assumptions based on his age and his appearance, and then you tried to humiliate him in front of everyone." Mr. Richardson looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would come to his rescue, but every face he saw reflected the same disappointment and anger. "Look, I made a mistake," he said, his voice much smaller than it had been earlier. "I was just trying to protect the integrity of first class," repeated the former military man with disbelief. "You mean you were trying to keep out people who you decided didn't look wealthy enough for your tastes?" Before Mr. Richardson could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "What exactly is going on here?" Everyone turned to see the captain, walking down the aisle from the front of the plane. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. The flight attendant, who had been at the center of the controversy, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "Captain Williams," the attorney said, stepping forward. "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss a serious situation involving discrimination against one of your passengers." The captain's expression grew serious as he took in the scene. Dozens of passengers crowded in the aisles, all focused on David, who was still standing quietly with the Victoria Cross visible around his neck. "I see," the captain said slowly. "And you are?" "Attorney Jennifer Walsh," she replied, handing him a business card. "And this is the young man who was removed from his paid first-class seat based purely on his appearance." Captain Williams looked at David, his eyes immediately drawn to the medal. As a former military pilot himself, he recognized it instantly. His entire demeanor changed. "Sir," he said to David, his voice filled with respect, "I need to hear exactly what happened." David glanced around at all the faces watching him, then looked back at the captain. "It's really not that big a deal, sir. There was just some confusion about my ticket." "It absolutely is a big deal," interrupted the elderly woman. "Captain, your crew accused this decorated veteran of fraud, moved him from his paid seat, and then threatened to have him removed from the aircraft when he questioned their actions." The captain's jaw tightened as he listened. He looked at the flight attendant, who was now visibly trembling. "Is this true?" he asked her directly. "Captain, we had concerns about the validity of his ticket," she said weakly. "What kind of concerns?" the captain asked, his voice getting colder. He didn't look like someone who could afford first class," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The captain stared at her for a long moment, then looked back at David. "Sir, may I ask what brings you to New York?" "My sister is in the hospital there," David replied simply. "Cancer treatment. I saved up for months to buy that ticket so I'd arrive ready to help her through her next round of chemotherapy." The captain closed his eyes briefly as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. When he opened them again, his expression was furious. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the economy section. "My crew removed a decorated military veteran from his paid first-class seat because they decided he looked too young and too poor to afford it. They did this while he was traveling to support his sister during cancer treatment." The flight attendant opened her mouth to say something, but the captain held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not finished," he said. "They then threatened to have him removed from the aircraft entirely when other passengers questioned this decision. Is that an accurate summary?" No one spoke, but the silence was answer enough. Captain Williams turned to David. "Sir, on behalf of the entire crew of this aircraft, I want to apologize. What happened to you was completely unacceptable and goes against everything our airline claims to stand for." He then addressed the cabin at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that this kind of treatment does not represent the values of our airline or our crew. Discrimination of any kind is absolutely prohibited, and what happened here today will be thoroughly investigated." The captain turned back to the flight attendant. "You are suspended from duty for the remainder of this flight. Report to my office immediately after we land." He then looked at Mr. Richardson, who had been trying to edge back toward first class, unnoticed. "And you, sir, I understand you played a significant role in escalating this situation?" Mr. Richardson stopped moving, realizing he'd been caught trying to escape. "Captain, I was just trying to maintain the standards of first class." "By publicly accusing a paying customer of fraud?" the captain asked. "By making assumptions about someone based on their age and clothing?" Mr. Richardson looked around desperately, but found no sympathy in any of the faces surrounding him. "I think," said the attorney, "that Mr. Richardson owes this young man a public apology. The same kind of public humiliation he tried to inflict should be returned to him." There was a murmur of agreement from the passengers. Mr. Richardson looked sick, but he knew he had no choice. I'm sorry," he said to David, his voice barely audible. "Louder," said the elderly woman, "so everyone can hear you the way everyone heard your accusations." Mr. Richardson cleared his throat and spoke louder. "I'm sorry for what I said. I was wrong to accuse you of fraud. I made assumptions about you that were completely unfair." David nodded acceptingly, but the captain wasn't finished. "Sir," Captain Williams said to David, "I want to personally escort you to first class where you should have been sitting all along. In fact, I'm upgrading you to our premium suite, the best accommodation we have on this aircraft." "That's really not necessary," David protested, but the captain was already walking toward the front of the plane. "Oh, but it is necessary," said the attorney with a smile. "It's the very least they can do." As David gathered his belongings, passengers began reaching out to shake his hand, pat his shoulder, and offer words of support. The elderly woman pressed a piece of paper into his hand. "That's my contact information, dear," she said. "If your sister needs anything at all, you call me. I have connections at some of the best hospitals in New York." The former military man stepped forward next. "Sir, it's been an honor sharing this flight with you. Your service means everything to people like us." Similar scenes played out as David made his way toward first class, escorted by the captain. Passengers were pulling out their phones, taking pictures, and sharing the story on social media. Victoria Cross Justice began trending before the plane had even started its descent into New York. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As word spread through social media about what had happened, passengers began organizing something completely unexpected. They started passing around phones and tablets, collecting digital donations for David's sister's medical expenses. "We can't undo what happened," explained the attorney as she helped coordinate the effort. "But we can do something positive to support this young man and his family." By the time David was settled into the premium suite in first class, a private cabin with a full bed, personal entertainment system, and dedicated flight attendant service, the passenger-organized fundraiser had already raised several $1,000s. The captain made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we witnessed something ugly, discrimination and prejudice based on appearance and assumptions. But we also witnessed something beautiful, people coming together to stand up for what's right and to support someone who has sacrificed for all of us." When the plane landed at JFK Airport, news crews were waiting. The story had already gone viral, and the airline's stock price was dropping as social media exploded with outrage over the initial treatment and praise for how the passengers had responded. David tried to avoid the cameras, but the story was too big to contain. Video footage of him being escorted to first class, wearing his Victoria Cross and carrying himself with quiet dignity, became one of the most shared clips of the year. The airline's CEO was waiting at the gate with a formal apology, and an offer of free flights for life for both David and his sister, the discriminatory flight attendant was terminated, and the entire crew was required to undergo extensive retraining on anti-discrimination policies. Mr. Richardson faced his own consequences when his employer saw the viral videos of his behavior. His company, which prided itself on diversity and inclusion, found his conduct incompatible